Hi, second grade scholars. This is Miss Dixon. Today is Tuesday, May 19th, 2020. Now, before we jump into a problem-solving task or anything like that, there's a couple things that I want to go over. So in our customary measurement unit, we know that we've talked and done some lessons about inches and feet. And we know that there are 12 inches in 1 foot, and 1 foot is the length of one ruler. Something else that we have started talking a little bit about is the difference between the sizes of our units that we know from the beginning of the year and also from this point in the year. So talking about centimeters, meters, inches, and feet. There are a couple other units that I want to go over really quickly with you. One of them is yards. If you've had a chance to watch the YouTube video that I've attached to the directions of our seesaw activities for measurement, you should know that a yard represents 3 feet. And so I want to show you here, I have a tape measure. So this tape measure is measuring inches. So as you can see, from here to here represents 1 total inch. And then a tape measure can also be used, it's a really great tool to use if you are doing any sort of crafts, if you're creating clothing, if you are creating blankets or anything like that, but also can be used when you're measuring. And so you can see here, from my finger to my other finger, this represents 12 inches, and that's 1 foot. But a yard represents 3 feet. So that means 3 groups of 12. So that would be from my finger to my finger. This is 36 inches, which represents 3 feet, and we also call this 1 yard. Now, football stadiums, soccer stadiums, they measure the length of their fields in yards. So that's just, you want to measure something that's bigger. Similarly, in the beginning of the year when we talked a little bit about centimeters and meters, we know that there's a meter stick which has 100 centimeters on it. Well, we also have yardsticks, and yardsticks represent 36 inches or 3 feet. So that's another unit of measure that you can think about. The other 2 units of measure that I want to talk about are miles and kilometers. So miles is the way we measure distance in our customary measure unit. So if I wanted to measure the distance between my house and school, I would measure that in miles. It's a very, very, very large unit. If I was using the metric system, so centimeters and meters, I would measure that distance in kilometers. So kilometers and miles are used to measure very far distances, often traveled in cars, in buses, in trains. Those are the units that you would use to measure those long distances. Okay, great. If we were in school, we would have had a chance to actually participate and go on a mile walk, where we would actually walk and feel what a full mile looks like. But unfortunately, we can't do that, so we're just going to mention them today to you. And I want you to keep these in mind because it's really important that whenever you have to measure something, in real life especially, and not just for schoolwork, but whenever you have to measure something, you have to think about what tool you're going to use to measure. So the tape measure that I was just showing you, I just rolled it up. The other tape measure that's retractable that I showed you last week, a ruler, a yardstick, a meter stick. You have to think about the tool that you're going to use, and you also have to think about the unit that you want to measure in. And that unit is going to depend on the size of the object that you're measuring. So for our problem-solving task today, we have to give some feedback. So as I'm getting myself set up over here, I want you to go ahead and grab your paper and pencil or something to write with that you have. So I'm going to zoom in to our problem-solving task. As you're getting those materials, I'm just going to read the directions for us. Now, the directions say, 2 first grade students are trying to get ready for when they learn about measurement next year in 2nd grade. They're making predictions about what units people should use to measure various lengths. Look at the predictions and decide if you agree with them and explain. So we have 2 students here, Natasha and Harvey, and both of them have made some predictions. Our job is to decide if we agree with them and then explain yes, why we do, or no, why we don't, using what we know about measurement, what we know about the size of these units and the different tools. So I'm going to zoom up here so you can see both. I'll read number 1 and then I'll read number 2, and then I'll give you some time to pause the video to get started. So number 1 says, Natasha says that it makes sense to measure the length of the classroom rug in either inches or centimeters. Do you agree with her? Why or why not? So make sure you're envisioning your classroom rug, the rug that you had in your classroom, and think if it makes sense to measure that in inches or centimeters. Would that be a good unit to use? And then number 2 says, Harvey says that the only unit that makes sense for measuring the length of the hallway is a meter. Do you agree with him? Why or why not? Remember, this word only means that's the only unit that you could use to measure the distance in the hallway. Take a minute right now to pause the video so you can answer these 2 questions, thinking about what you know about these units of measure, and then we'll spend some time going over it. So pause the video right now. Okay. I hope you've had some time to work on your problem solving task. So let's take a look at the first one. So Natasha says that it makes sense to measure the length of a classroom rug in either inches or centimeters. So I'm thinking right now, a classroom rug. Okay, so all of my students can fit on that classroom rug. We fit along the outside in a circle. We have our row spots. So it's pretty big. It's a pretty big object. Now, what do I know about inches and centimeters? Well, inches and centimeters are small units. I know that when I was doing some benchmarks last week, we talked about how a key is 2 inches. That's a really small amount of space. I don't think, because the rug is a large object, and if we're measuring a large object, we need to use a unit that is a larger unit that takes up more space. It's going to be easier for us, and we'll be able to get a more precise measurement. So unfortunately, I disagree with Natasha, and I hope you did too. So I do not agree with Natasha because a classroom rug is a very large object to measure, and inches / centimeters are a very small unit. Instead, I would use, what would I use? I need a larger unit to measure. I know that feet would be a larger unit, meters would be a larger unit, yard, like we talked about in the beginning of this video, would be a larger unit. I feel like those could make sense. I don't think, though, that miles or kilometers would, because definitely a rug is not as big as 1 mile. So instead, I would use, and I think the most accurate unit would probably be feet. I would use feet to measure the rug. And the reason why I'm thinking that is because while the rug is a large unit, a large object, it's not incredibly large like a football field. And remember, I talked about how in for football fields, they measure those in yards in terms of the number of yards. But for something like a rug, it's a lot smaller than the length of a football field. So I think a unit that's in between inches and centimeters and yards would make sense, and that would be feet. Great. Hopefully you're kind of following along with my think aloud process as we're answering these, and that's helping you kind of get a better sense of what unit makes the most sense to measure which object. Number 2 says, Harvey says that the only unit that makes sense for measuring the length of the hallway is a meter. Do you agree with him? Well, I have to agree that yes, a meter would make sense. I'm visualizing a meter stick right now. And I do know that a meter stick, I remember from the beginning of the year that the length of the doorway was about 2 meters. So because of that, I do think it makes sense that we could measure it with a meter stick, but I disagree here. I don't think it's the only unit. Similarly, I think that we could also use a yard or a yardstick even as the tool to measure it. So I would say I agree that a meter is a unit you could use to measure the length of the hallway. I also think you could measure it in yards. Awesome. So now we're going to take a look at some problems together. We're going to do a couple of these together, and the rest of them you'll do on your own by pausing the video. But our job is to write down all the logical units to measure the following objects. And I created a word bank for us just in case we forgot some of our units. And in the word bank we have centimeters, feet, miles, meters, yards, kilometers, and inches. And I'm going to underline those that are in our customary measurement unit. It doesn't matter exactly, but I just wanted you to see it, that these 4 units are in customary measurement, and that's the measurement system that we use here in the United States. Centimeters, kilometers, and meters are the metric system that we learned about in the beginning of the year. So we have to write down all of the logical units to measure the objects. So the first one is the height of a door. Okay, we just talked about how in the beginning of the year we knew the height of the door represented 2 meters, so we definitely could use meters for this. We could totally use yards. If you can use meters, you can definitely use yards, and vice versa, because they're about the same length. 100 centimeters is about 36 inches, and so that represents 1 meter and 1 yard. But I also think the height of the door, you could also successfully measure it in feet as well. So those would be the 3 units that I would use. The length of a book. Well, the length of the book is not a humongous number. It's not a humongous object. It's not very large, so it really wouldn't make sense for me to use miles or kilometers. That wouldn't make sense. And it's also a lot smaller than 1 meter or 1 yard. So that means I'm left with centimeters, feet, and inches. And I think there's only 2 options here. While some books, especially like textbooks that you might see when you get older, are bigger than 1 foot, most books are smaller than 1 foot. So I would use the 2 smallest units that I have, centimeters or feet. Not feet, silly Miss Dixon, or inches. Awesome. Some of you might even argue that says inches are better because it would take up less, because a measurement of a book would take less inches than it would centimeters, and that's fine. I think you could go either way depending on the size of the book you're reading. We're going to do 2 more together, and then you're going to do the rest by yourself. So the length of a refrigerator magnet. Maybe you have a refrigerator magnet on your refrigerator. I know for me, those magnets are really small. So I would use the smaller units. Definitely could measure a refrigerator magnet in centimeters. And I think I definitely could also measure it in inches. Because it's such a small object, I need a small unit to measure. Number 4, distance from here to Brook, East Boston. Well, let's pretend here is Brook, Roslindale. That means we have to go from one side of the city of Boston to the other side of the city for Boston. That's a really large distance. And I know for me, if I was doing that, I'd probably be in a bus or a train or a car. And because of that, I could measure that in miles or kilometers. Both of those are really large units that would measure the large distance, especially distances between two places. Awesome. Now, I want you to pause the video here and I want you to write down the possible units that you would use to measure, actually I'll zoom out so you can see the word bank. The possible units that you would use to measure, question 5, height of a water bottle, height of a basketball hoop, distance from Brook to California, the length of a paperclip, the length of the hallway, and the length of a mouse. So go ahead and answer questions 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 on your own right now, and then you can pause the video and we'll go over the answers after. Okay, great. Hopefully you had some time to fill these out, but let's imagine a water bottle right now. A water bottle is not a super tiny object, but sometimes a water bottle is also not huge. So I need a unit that's somewhere in between. I think centimeters would be a little bit too small for this, but I do think that inches would be the ideal unit here because it's a little bit bigger. And like I said, some water bottles are like the length of a book, and some of them are even larger. So we need to make sure that we're using a unit that would make sense. Number 6, height of a basketball hoop. Well, a height of a basketball hoop is taller than me, which means that I definitely couldn't use centimeters and I definitely couldn't use inches, but I could use feet. And I also think you could use meters or yards as well because it is that tall. Awesome. Let's move on and do the next couple. So distance from Brook to California. Well, in order for me to go to Boston to California, I would probably have to travel on an airplane. I could drive my car, although it would take me a long time, or I could even jump on a train or a bus. Because it's such a long distance and I'm going from one place to another, I would definitely measure this in terms of miles or kilometers. All right. Number 8, length of a paperclip. Picture a paperclip in your head. I don't think I have one here to share with you, but a paperclip is a very small object. Because it's a small object, we definitely need to use the smallest unit of measure available to us, which would be centimeters. If you also had inches here, I think that's okay, but I do think the smaller unit, centimeters, would give you a more accurate answer. Let's zoom in for the last 2. Length of the hallway. Well, we actually did this earlier in our problem solving task where we agreed with Harvey that you could definitely use meters, but also yards. And then length of a mouse. A mouse is not a very large animal. Because it's not a very large animal, I'm going to need smaller units of measure. And I think depending on the size, it could be a baby mouse or it could be a fully grown mouse. You could either use centimeters or inches. I think either would work here. Awesome. So whenever you're trying to figure out the best unit of measure to use to measure an object's height or its length or its width, it's really important that you visualize what that object looks like and the size of that object, and also then think about your units of measure. Think about your small units like centimeters or inches, and then think about the big units like miles and kilometers, and then those in between like feet, yards, and meters, in order to be able to correctly choose the best unit to measure that object in. If you have any questions about what we did today together, please make sure you reach out to your teachers. Also, please make sure that right now you switch over to the rest of your rest of the activity that's in Seesaw, and you work on that exit ticket. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will be back tomorrow with another math video.